the most powerful woman in Europe, walked into the Oval Office carrying the weight of an entire continent. When she left, everything felt different. There were no loud arguments, no dramatic announcements, no breaking news headlines in that moment. But what happened inside that room was quiet, calculated, and far more serious than it appeared. Because Donald Trump didn't attack Europe directly. He simply changed his position. And when Ursula von der Leyen said 3 simple words, "I will not pay," she didn't realize how much that statement would shape the rest of the conversation. The invitation itself was unusual. It didn't come with the usual diplomatic process. There were no joint press statements, no planned photo sessions, no friendly tone. Instead, it came quietly, through back channels. Officials in Brussels noticed immediately that something felt off. This wasn't a normal meeting between allies. It felt more like a serious confrontation. For weeks, Ursula von der Leyen prepared carefully. Her team gathered detailed reports, trade data, defense spending numbers, legal frameworks, and economic forecasts. They studied every possible scenario. They practiced responses late into the night, preparing for tough questions. By the time she arrived in Washington, she was ready for a difficult discussion. But she made one major mistake. She expected a debate. She expected questions. What she didn't expect was a completely different approach. When her motorcade reached the White House, everything seemed calm on the outside. Inside, however, the atmosphere quickly changed. The room setup itself felt different. It was subtle, but noticeable. Her team felt slightly pushed back, while the American side controlled the space. Donald Trump stood in the center of the room. He didn't step forward to greet her. He didn't smile or offer a handshake. There was a brief silence that felt longer than it actually was. When Ursula von der Leyen extended her hand, he looked at it, but didn't take it. After a few seconds, she lowered her hand. The tone of the meeting was already clear. Then he spoke, directly and without formalities. "You know why you're here." No titles. No diplomatic language, just a straightforward statement. A folder was placed on the desk and slid toward her. Inside was a detailed document. It wasn't a starting point for negotiation. It was presented as a final calculation, a long-term view of defense spending and economic relations between the United States and Europe. At the center of the document was a very large number, $2.3 trillion. It represented decades of military spending and support. When she read it, she looked up and responded calmly. "I will not pay." She said it with confidence, representing her position clearly. But that response didn't create tension in the way she expected. Instead, Donald Trump remained calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't react emotionally. He simply smiled slightly, as if the response matched what he had anticipated. He spoke again, quietly. "That's exactly what I expected." From that point on, the tone shifted even further. This was no longer a negotiation. It felt like a prepared sequence of actions being explained step by step. He began outlining a series of policy decisions. These weren't emotional reactions. They were structured plans. Each part focused on economic pressure, trade adjustments, and strategic changes. One of the key points was trade tariffs. A major increase on European goods, especially automobiles, was discussed as part of a broader economic strategy. This wasn't presented as a threat, but as a decision that had already been considered in detail. For Europe, industries like automotive manufacturing are extremely important. Companies like Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz play a major role in their economies. Any major shift in trade conditions could have wide effects. The message being delivered wasn't loud or aggressive. It was controlled and direct, and that made it more serious. Throughout the meeting, Ursula von der Leyen listened carefully. She had prepared for a debate, but instead, she was hearing a plan that seemed already set in motion. The discussion continued with more details about economic adjustments, defense expectations, and future relations. Each point built on the last, forming a clear direction. By the end of the meeting, nothing dramatic had happened on the surface. No arguments, no public conflict. But the underlying message was clear. The relationship between the United States and Europe was entering a new phase. When Ursula von der Leyen left the Oval Office, she carried more than just documents. She carried the realization that the dynamics had shifted. This wasn't about one meeting. It was about a change in approach, a new direction in international relations, and the beginning of a different kind of conversation between longtime partners. He repeated the timeline slowly so she would fully understand. By the time leaders in Brussels gathered for their first emergency meeting, it would already be too late to stop the impact. Factories in Germany would begin cutting production. Workers' unions would react. The government, already under pressure, would be forced to focus on its own internal problems instead of supporting a wider European response. But the auto industry was only the beginning. Donald Trump continued explaining the rest of the trade measures with the same calm and steady tone. There was no rush in his voice, no anger, just precision. He outlined higher tariffs on different sectors: pharmaceuticals from France, industrial machinery from Italy, and luxury goods like wine, perfume, and fashion products would all be affected. These weren't random choices. Each number had been carefully calculated to target specific industries that were important to each country's economy. The strategy was simple but effective. Instead of dealing with the European Union as one single group, he focused on individual countries. Each nation would face its own economic pressure at the same time. That way, instead of working together, each government would be busy handling its own crisis. Countries like France, Italy, Germany, and Austria would all feel the pressure in different ways. The result would be division instead of unity. It wasn't just a trade policy. It was a way to weaken coordination between European governments. Then he moved to the second phase, and this was where things became more serious. The focus shifted from trade to finance. Donald Trump explained that financial systems were also under review. Access to dollar-based funding, which is critical for global finance, could be restricted or adjusted. This might sound technical, but for Europe, it's extremely important. European banks, governments, and financial institutions rely heavily on smooth access to the global dollar system. Their economies are closely connected to American financial structures. Changing that access would create pressure across the entire system. This wouldn't happen suddenly in one dramatic moment. Instead, it would build slowly. Borrowing costs would rise. Governments would find it harder to fund their programs. Financial markets would react step by step. The European Central Bank could try to respond, but its tools would become less effective over time if market confidence started to weaken. Programs that people depend on, healthcare, pensions, public salaries, could all face pressure if borrowing became more expensive. It wasn't presented as a threat. It was described as a likely outcome of financial changes. When Donald Trump explained this part, he looked directly at Ursula von der Leyen. He even mentioned social systems and asked how Europe would continue funding them if financial conditions became more difficult. It didn't feel like a real question. It felt more like a statement about what could happen next. For the first time, there was no clear response. Not because she lacked preparation, but because the situation being described went beyond normal negotiation. The plan he described wasn't theoretical. It wasn't just pressure for leverage. It was already being considered at an operational level. The biggest issue wasn't military strength or energy supply. It was something deeper: Europe's dependence on a financial system that is strongly connected to the United States. The room felt different now. Everyone could sense the shift, even if no one said it out loud. The documents and preparation that Ursula von der Leyen had brought with her no longer seemed useful in this moment. Then came the third phase. This one wasn't about economics. It was about security. Donald Trump stepped closer and spoke clearly. He said that within 90 days, the American military presence in Europe would come to an end. Not reduced, not adjusted, ended. The statement was delivered calmly, but its meaning was serious. Major military bases would be closed. Equipment would be removed. Operations would stop. Facilities like Ramstein Air Base in Germany, Aviano Air Base in Italy, and key installations in the United Kingdom would no longer operate in the same way. Military assets, aircraft, defense systems, and support networks would be withdrawn. Missile defense systems in Eastern Europe would also be affected. These systems play an important role in regional security, especially for countries closer to potential conflict zones. The timeline was clear: 90 days. Again, there was no dramatic tone, just a straightforward explanation. He also mentioned that communication with other global powers had already taken place. The message was simple: the United States would step back, and Europe would handle its own regional security matters moving forward. This wasn't presented as a threat. It was presented as a shift in responsibility. For decades, Europe had built its system with the understanding that American support would always be there. Now that assumption was being questioned. Ursula von der Leyen tried to respond, but the situation had changed too much. The discussion was no longer based on shared assumptions. The framework of the conversation itself had shifted. She had prepared for negotiation within an existing system, but now, that system was being redefined. Her composure remained, but the pressure was clear. Meanwhile, Donald Trump had already turned back toward his desk, reviewing other documents as if the meeting had reached its natural conclusion. There was no formal ending, no closing statements. The meeting simply finished. She was escorted out through a side exit, away from cameras and public attention. The motorcade back to the airport was quiet. No one spoke much. The weight of the conversation stayed with everyone present. During the flight back, the atmosphere remained tense. The document was still in her hands. She hadn't put it down. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly beneath the plane. Inside, there was a growing realization that something significant had changed. When she arrived in Brussels, the city was still active, the lights still on, people still going about their normal routines. But for Ursula von der Leyen, the situation felt very different. The meeting hadn't just been about policies or numbers. It had marked a turning point, a moment where long-standing expectations were challenged, and a new phase of international relations had begun.